What if I told you that China planted 100 billion trees across 4,500 kilometers of desert in the largest reforestation project in human history, creating a man-made forest barrier longer than the Great Wall? It sounds like environmental fantasy, right? Well, China actually did this, and the result, after 40 years, has transformed not just their landscape, but inspired desert restoration projects from Africa to Australia. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. The scale of transformation visible from space has redefined what scientists thought was possible in desert reclamation. Picture this. You're flying over northern China in 1978, looking down at an endless expanse of yellow sand stretching to every horizon. The Gobi Desert is advancing southward at 3,400 square kilometers per year, an area larger than Rhode Island disappearing under sand dunes annually. Below, you can see abandoned villages, buried farmland, and millions of environmental refugees fleeing the advancing desert. The scale of ecological disaster is almost incomprehensible. Sandstorms originating in the Gobi are so massive they block out the sun over Beijing, 1,000 kilometers away. The storms carry 1.3 million tons of dust annually, affecting air quality across Asia and even reaching North America. Desertification threatens 27% of China's total land area, territory home to 400 million people. But now imagine flying over the same route in 2018. Instead of endless sand, you see an unbroken line of green forest stretching across the entire northern frontier. Trees march in perfect formation across former desert, creating a living wall that stands between fertile China and the advancing Gobi. The transformation is so dramatic that astronauts report it as one of the most visible human-made changes on Earth's surface. This is the Great Green Wall of China, officially known as the 3 North Shelter Forest Program. It represents the largest coordinated environmental engineering project in human history, involving the systematic planting of 100 billion trees across territory larger than most countries. But to understand why China would attempt something so ambitious it seemed impossible, we need to go back to the crisis that threatened to bury northern China under sand. For centuries, the Gobi Desert had been expanding southward, but human activities in the 20th century accelerated the process dramatically. Overgrazing by livestock stripped protective vegetation from marginal lands. Intensive farming depleted soil nutrients and broke down natural windbreaks. Population pressure drove people to cultivate increasingly marginal land that couldn't sustain agriculture long-term. The result was ecological catastrophe on a continental scale. By the 1970s, desertification was consuming Chinese farmland at unprecedented rates. Each year, an area equivalent to Connecticut was lost to advancing sand dunes. The process wasn't gradual. Entire villages would be buried in single massive sandstorms that lasted for days. Beijing itself was under siege. Dust storms originating 1,000 kilometers away in the Gobi would engulf the capital in choking yellow clouds that shut down airports, schools, and businesses. The storms deposited millions of tons of sand and dust on the city each year, turning day into night and making outdoor activities impossible. The economic impact was staggering. Agricultural losses from desertification exceeded $6 billion annually. Environmental refugees, people fleeing advancing desert, numbered in the millions. Infrastructure was constantly buried and required expensive clearing operations. Air pollution from dust storms created health crises affecting hundreds of millions of people. International experts studying the crisis concluded that northern China was experiencing irreversible ecological collapse. The UN warned that desertification could make vast regions uninhabitable within decades. Climate scientists predicted that continued desert expansion would transform China's agricultural heartland into wasteland. Most sobering of all, the expansion was accelerating. What had taken centuries now happened in decades, and what had taken decades now happened in years. The Gobi Desert was growing faster than any natural process could reverse. Traditional conservation approaches were failing completely. Attempts to reduce grazing pressure met resistance from pastoral communities with few alternatives. Soil conservation programs couldn't keep pace with erosion rates. International aid focused on managing the crisis rather than solving it. That's when Chinese leadership proposed something that environmental experts called both visionary and impossible. They would stop the desert by planting a wall of trees across the entire northern frontier. The proposal seemed to defy everything scientists knew about desert ecology. Trees require water, nutrients, and stable soil, none of which existed in advancing desert zones. Previous reforestation attempts in arid regions had failed catastrophically, with survival rates below 10%. The scale proposed by China, 4,500 kilometers of continuous forest, was 20 times larger than any successful reforestation project in history. Critics lined up to explain why the Great Green Wall was doomed to failure. Desert ecology experts pointed out that most tree species couldn't survive in arid conditions with annual rainfall below 400 millimeters. Soil scientists warned that planting in sandy desert soil would simply result in mass tree mortality. Hydrologists calculated that irrigation requirements would exceed available water resources by enormous margins. International environmental organizations called the project ecological suicide and a waste of resources that could be better spent on adaptation. Major scientific journals published papers explaining why large-scale tree planting in deserts was biologically impossible. Even within China, many scientists and economists argued for accepting desertification and managing its impacts rather than attempting to reverse it. But Chinese planners had advantages that critics didn't fully appreciate. They had studied successful small-scale reforestation projects across Asia and identified tree species adapted to semi-arid conditions. They had access to massive human resources, millions of workers who could be mobilized for planting operations. Most importantly, they had political commitment to sustain efforts across multiple decades regardless of initial setbacks. The Great Green Wall officially launched in 1978 with goals that seemed almost fantastical. Plant forests across 4,500 kilometers of northern frontier, restore 36 million hectares of degraded land, and increase forest coverage from 5% to 15% across the entire region. The timeline was equally ambitious: complete the project by 2050, requiring sustained planting operations across 72 years. The initial planting operations were an exercise in organized chaos on an unprecedented scale. Each spring, millions of workers, farmers, students, soldiers, and volunteers deployed across the desert frontier, armed with shovels, saplings, and determination. The logistics were staggering, transporting billions of seedlings to remote desert locations, providing water for initial establishment, and coordinating planting across thousands of kilometers of hostile terrain. The early years were marked by massive failures and hard-learned lessons. Entire plantings died during their first summer as young trees succumbed to heat, drought, and sandstorms. Species selection proved critical. Non-native trees failed completely, while hardy local varieties like poplar, pine, and tamarisk showed survival potential. Planting techniques required constant refinement as workers learned to create wind protection and moisture retention for vulnerable seedlings. But Chinese planners had anticipated high mortality rates and planned accordingly. For every tree that survived, they planted 10. Planting operations were repeated annually in the same locations until establishment succeeded. Failed sections were replanted with different species and improved techniques. The scale of effort was so massive that even 20% survival rates meant millions of trees establishing each year. The breakthrough came in the mid-1980s, when survival rates began improving dramatically. Scientists had identified optimal tree species for different desert conditions. Planting techniques evolved to include windbreaks, soil improvement, and water conservation methods. Most importantly, early successful plantings began creating microclimates that improved conditions for subsequent planting. The trees that survived their first few years began transforming their immediate environments. Root systems stabilized soil and prevented erosion. Leaf litter improved soil composition and water retention. Wind patterns changed as trees created barriers that reduced sandstorm intensity. Wildlife began returning to areas that had been biological deserts for decades. By 1990, satellite imagery began showing the first continuous green corridors across formerly desert regions. The Great Green Wall was becoming visible from space, as a distinct line of vegetation cutting across northern China. International scientists who had predicted failure began acknowledging that something unprecedented was occurring. The planting operations themselves evolved into sophisticated environmental engineering. Different tree species were deployed in carefully planned sequences, fast-growing pioneers to establish initial cover, followed by slower-growing species that would create permanent forest canopy. Spacing, orientation, and species mixing were optimized based on local climate and soil conditions. Water management became increasingly sophisticated as the project progressed. Initial reliance on irrigation gave way to drought-resistant species and improved soil moisture retention. Terracing and contour planting maximized water capture from limited rainfall. Underground water sources were protected and enhanced rather than depleted. Perhaps most importantly, the project began generating its own positive feedback loops. Areas with established tree cover showed increased rainfall as vegetation influenced local weather patterns. Improved soil conditions supported not just trees, but entire plant communities that enhanced ecosystem stability. Wildlife populations returned and contributed to seed dispersal and ecosystem health. The human dimension of the project was equally remarkable. Entire generations of Chinese workers devoted their lives to tree planting operations. Families relocated to desert frontiers to participate in reforestation efforts. Children grew up in communities where annual tree planting was a civic duty comparable to military service. Local economic incentives aligned with environmental goals as communities discovered that successful reforestation created opportunities for sustainable forestry, fruit production, and ecotourism. Villages that had been abandoned due to advancing desert became thriving communities surrounded by human-made forests. The scale of human mobilization was unprecedented in environmental history. At peak operations, over 10 million people participated in annual planting campaigns. The total human effort invested in the Great Green Wall exceeded that of any single construction project in history, including the original Great Wall of China. International monitoring began documenting results that defied pessimistic predictions. By 2000, over 20 billion trees had been planted with survival rates exceeding 50% in many areas. Forest coverage in the target region had increased from 5% to 12%, with some areas showing complete transformation from desert to woodland. But the most dramatic changes were yet to come. As plantings matured and forest ecosystems established themselves, the environmental impacts began cascading beyond the immediate planting areas. The Great Green Wall was creating regional climate effects that transformed entire landscapes. Satellite data showed that dust storm frequency and intensity were declining dramatically in areas protected by established forests. Beijing's air quality improved measurably, as reduced dust storms meant fewer pollution episodes. The yellow dust that had plagued East Asia for decades was being intercepted by China's growing forest barrier. Agricultural productivity began recovering in areas that had been marginally productive due to sandstorm damage. Farmers reported improved soil quality, reduced wind erosion, and more stable growing conditions. Crop yields increased as agricultural areas gained protection from the expanding forest network. Water resources showed remarkable improvement as forest cover increased precipitation and groundwater recharge. Springs that had dried up began flowing again. Rivers that had become seasonal maintained year-round flows. Underground water tables rose as improved vegetation cover enhanced infiltration and reduced evaporation. Wildlife populations exploded in areas that had been biological deserts just decades earlier. Over 200 bird species returned to regions where they had been locally extinct. Mammals, including deer, foxes, and even wolves, recolonized forest areas. Biodiversity surveys documented complete ecosystem restoration in successfully forested areas. By 2010, the Great Green Wall had achieved forest establishment across over 25 million hectares, an area larger than the United Kingdom. The continuous green barrier was clearly visible in satellite imagery as a massive arc of forest cutting across northern China from the Pacific coast to Central Asia. But the most surprising developments came after 2015, when long-term monitoring revealed transformation effects that exceeded every scientific prediction. The Great Green Wall hadn't just stopped desert expansion, it had begun reversing it. Climate data showed precipitation increases of 10 to 20% across the forested region compared to pre-planting baselines. The forest barrier was creating its own weather patterns, generating rainfall that supported further vegetation growth. Areas that had received less than 200 millimeters of annual rainfall were now getting 300-400 millimeters, enough to support agriculture and permanent settlements. Carbon storage calculations revealed that the Great Green Wall had become one of the world's most significant carbon sinks. The 66 billion trees that had successfully established were storing approximately 315 million tons of carbon dioxide, equivalent to removing 50 million cars from roads permanently. This carbon sequestration was increasing annually as forests matured and expanded. Desert reversal became visible in time-lapse satellite imagery. Sand dunes that had advanced for centuries began retreating as vegetation stabilized soil and changed wind patterns. Areas that had been classified as desert in 1978 were supporting grasslands, shrublands, and even agricultural activities by 2018. The biodiversity transformation was spectacular. Scientific surveys documented over 1,500 plant species and 2,300 animal species in areas that had been essentially lifeless desert 4 decades earlier. New ecosystems were emerging that combined characteristics of forest, grassland, and desert edge habitats, creating unique environments found nowhere else on Earth. Economic benefits reached billions of dollars annually. The forestry industry emerging from Great Green Wall plantings employed over 100,000 people in previously desolate regions. Fruit and nut production from forest areas generated substantial agricultural income. Ecotourism brought millions of visitors to see the world's largest man-made forest. Air quality improvements extended far beyond China's borders. Dust storm reduction benefited South Korea, Japan, and even the western United States, where trans-Pacific dust clouds had been a persistent air quality problem. International climate scientists calculated that Great Green Wall forest cover was influencing weather patterns across the entire North Pacific region. The success began attracting international attention as a potential model for addressing global desertification. Africa launched its own Great Green Wall project across the Sahel, directly inspired by Chinese achievements. Australia began large-scale reforestation projects to combat expanding interior deserts. Middle Eastern countries initiated tree planting programs using techniques refined in China. Research collaboration expanded globally as scientists sought to understand and replicate Great Green Wall successes. Chinese forestry experts began advising reforestation projects on 6 continents. International students traveled to China to study large-scale ecosystem restoration techniques. The knowledge base developed through 40 years of tree planting became a global resource for environmental restoration. Technology transfer accelerated as Chinese innovations in desert forestry proved applicable to similar environments worldwide. Drought-resistant tree varieties developed for the Great Green Wall were adapted for use in Africa, Australia, and the Americas. Planting techniques, soil improvement methods, and water conservation strategies were exported globally. The project's success also inspired urban forest initiatives worldwide. Cities began implementing large-scale tree planting programs using organizational methods developed for the Great Green Wall. The mass mobilization techniques proven in Chinese deserts were adapted for urban air quality improvement and climate resilience programs. Scientific research revealed that the Great Green Wall was creating ecosystem services worth over $100 billion annually. Air quality improvement, carbon storage, water resource enhancement, soil conservation, and climate regulation provided economic benefits far exceeding the project's total costs. The investment in tree planting was generating returns that made it one of the most successful environmental programs in history. International climate agreements began recognizing the Great Green Wall as a model for nature-based climate solutions. The project demonstrated that large-scale ecosystem restoration could be achieved through coordinated human effort and sustained political commitment. Techniques developed in China became templates for climate adaptation and mitigation strategies worldwide. Perhaps most importantly, the Great Green Wall proved that humanity could reverse large-scale environmental degradation through determined collective action. What had seemed impossible in 1978, stopping and reversing desert expansion across continental scales, had been achieved through 4 decades of sustained effort. Today, visitors to the Great Green Wall encounter landscapes that seem almost miraculous. Where sand dunes once marched relentlessly southward, dense forests now stretch to the horizon. Villages that had been abandoned to advancing desert are surrounded by productive orchards and thriving ecosystems. Wildlife that had been locally extinct for generations has returned to landscapes that were lifeless just decades ago. The transformation continues as second and third generation forests mature and expand. Areas initially planted with pioneer species are developing complex forest ecosystems with diverse wildlife populations. Natural regeneration is extending forest cover beyond the original planted areas as improved conditions support spontaneous vegetation growth. China plans to continue the Great Green Wall project through 2050, with goals of reaching 42 million hectares of forest coverage and 15% forest coverage across the entire northern region. The success of the first 40 years has generated momentum for even more ambitious restoration targets. The project has also inspired China to launch additional massive reforestation programs in other regions. Similar approaches are being applied to combat desertification in Western China and restore degraded landscapes throughout the country. The organizational capacity and technical expertise developed through the Great Green Wall are being deployed for ecosystem restoration across China's entire territory. International recognition continues growing as climate scientists study the Great Green Wall's global impact. The project is increasingly cited as proof that large-scale environmental problems can be solved through coordinated human action. The forest barrier created by 100 billion trees has become a symbol of hope for addressing climate change and environmental degradation worldwide. From barren desert to thriving forest, from environmental crisis to ecological success, from national project to global inspiration. China's Great Green Wall proves that human determination can transform Earth's most hostile environments into thriving ecosystems. The trees that now stretch across 4,500 kilometers of former desert stand as living monuments to what becomes possible when environmental vision meets sustained commitment. What other planetary-scale environmental challenges do you think could be addressed through similar coordinated human effort?